The second part of the environmental analysis is the micro. The micro environmental analysis is the second step in the SWOT. This is an industry analysis. It's not about the business specifically. The industry can be as broad or as narrow as you wish. We talked about McDonald's. McDonald's could be classified as part of the restaurant industry or part of the fast food restaurant industry. You can even narrow it down to fast food restaurants that sell hamburgers. It's always from the firm's point of view. We'll talk about the power of buyers, and we're talking about the firm's buyers. And we'll talk about the power of suppliers, so we'll talk about the firm's suppliers. Threats and power are always ranked as high, medium, or low. If you get really weird about it, you can put medium high and medium low as well. So what makes up the environmental analysis? The main tool that we use is Porter's 5 forces of competition. Porter's 5 forces of competition are made up of each of these plus its interaction. The first one is the bargaining power of buyers. The bargaining power of buyers has to do with how much power your buyer has. The second one is the bargaining power of suppliers and how much power your suppliers have. The third is the threat of new entrants. The fourth is the threat of substitute products. And the fifth is the intensity of rivalry. And these all work together. I'll show you in just a second here. But when we were working on this, we found out that there was one thing that was really, really hard to deal with. And so, Porter's 5 plus 1. The plus 1, the power of donors. Now this is only used for nonprofits, but it's a very important one. So this is Porter's 5 forces of competition. Their influence and interaction. The power of suppliers, threat of new entrants, the power of buyers, and the threat of substitute products all interact with the intensity of rivalry. But you can also see that the power of suppliers will impact the threat of new entrants, and the threat of substitute products also interacts with the threat of new entrants. So you can see how they all interact. The plus 1, the power of donors, mainly acts the same way as the power of suppliers. The bargaining power of buyers, also known, and you'll hear me refer to it as the power of buyers. These are the firm's buyers, the people who buy the firm's products. The power the buyer has over the firm to force the firm to make changes in the product or service and or to affect the prices. This is the definition of what the bargaining power of buyers. So the more power the buyer has to make the firm either change the product or to make the firm change its price, then the higher the power is. So what affects the power of buyers? Well, switching cost. Switching cost is how much it costs to move from one product to a similar product or from one particular company to another. So for example, what would it cost for me to change from McDonald's to Burger King? How many buyers there are? In general, the more buyers there are, the less power they have. And the bigger the buyer, the more power they have. So let's take Walmart for example. If Rubbermaid and they wanted to have a large price increase and Walmart, being their biggest buyer, said no, well then Rubbermaid had to do what Walmart says. But when there are a lot of buyers, they don't have a lot of power. So if you would walk into McDonald's and say, I don't think you should put pickles on your burgers, they don't really care what you think. However, there's an exception to this rule, and that's when there are a large number of small buyers who can band together. In the case of McDonald's, the buyers, a group of buyers, got together and said, We will boycott you unless you stop using styrofoam. And McDonald's had to comply. Demand. When demand is high, then the power of buyers is low. Buyer identity. If we want a buyer to be identified with our product, then that increases the power of the buyer. The amount of information that's available also affects power of buyers. The more information, the more power. Immediacy. How quickly does the buyer have to have this product? If the buyer can wait, then his power goes up. But if it's something that has to be had right now, then the power of the buyer goes down. And if it's a commodity, mainly because sugar is sugar, buyer can go to a different firm. And the threat of substitute products. When the threat of substitute products is high, the power of buyers is high. The bargaining power of suppliers. Now remember, these are the firm's suppliers, also known as the power of suppliers. Okay, don't forget when we're talking about suppliers, don't forget the human side of it, unions or how many people are available in the workforce. The power the supplier has over the firm to force the firm to make changes in the product or service and to accept higher prices. So if a firm has the ability to say, I'm sorry, we're not going to produce ABC widgets anymore, now you have to take XYZ kinds of widgets, and the firm has to accept that, then that means that the power of the suppliers is high. What affects the power of suppliers? The number. The more suppliers there are, the less power they have. Switching costs. Switching costs in this case could be how much it would cost to retool or how much it would cost to get out of contracts. Demand. When demand is high, the power of suppliers is high. When the size of the supplier is big, if there's only a big supplier, then chances are their power goes up. Specialization. The more specialized the product, the higher the supplier's power. Integration. If there is a chance that a supplier can buy you, then his power goes up. And the threat of substitute products. The higher the threat, the lower the power. Okay, so let's talk about the power of donors. The power of donors are also known as +1 in Porter's 5. These are the firm's donors. And the one thing that you have to remember is that it's not just cash. Okay, it can be any kind of a resource. The power the donors have over whether the firm can perform its activities with respect to money, cash, or other resources. Okay, that's the official definition. So what affects the power of donors? The number of donors available, how much it would cost for a donor to move from one place to another. And remember, that could be psychological. The demand for donors. Sometimes it's also the demand for the services that the company is providing. The size of the donors. It's easier for big donors to give big money. And the amount of information that's available to the donors about services and financial ratios and so on. And the threat of substitute products. What else could the donor be giving money to? The threat of substitute products. The availability of another product or service that can be used for the same purpose. Do not mix this up with substitute brands. If you're selling Pepsi, then Tropicana is a substitute product. It's used for the same purpose. So is bottled water. But Coca-Cola is not. Coca-Cola is simply a different brand of the same product. What affects the threat of substitute products? The availability of good substitutes. Now we say good substitutes because not all substitutes are viable. For example, I don't like to fly, but I'm going to have to go to a conference and it's in New Orleans. And because it's during the semester, I don't have time to drive. So driving is not a good substitute. Riding a horse is a substitute, but it's not a good substitute. Sometimes driving a car could be a good substitute. So the more available good substitutes are, then the higher the threat. If price is reasonably the same, the threat is up. If the features are comparable, the threat is up. If switching costs are low, the threat is up. If the buyer's comfort level is high, the threat goes up. The next one is threat of new entrants. What are the chances that a new firm is going to enter the industry? And what affects this? Well, entry and exit barriers. If it's very expensive to get in, either cash-wise or knowledge-wise or some kind of a competitive advantage or resources, or if it costs a lot of money to get out, exit barriers. So if entry barriers and exit barriers are high, then the threat is low. The more profitable an industry is, the higher the threat. If there are gaps in the industry, mostly geographic, but they could be niche gaps, then the threat goes up. If there's strong customer loyalty, the threat will go down. If the industry is attractive, and that means low rivalry, low power of buyers, low power of suppliers, few substitute products, then the threat goes up. All of these impact the intensity of rivalry, which is the degree to which current members of an industry will fight for market share or to dominate the market. What affects it? Aggression. Some companies are just simply aggressive. Coke and Pepsi, for example, are both very aggressive. High demand. The size and number of competitors will affect the intensity of rivalry. Few large competitors means that intensity of rivalry will increase. Commodity products often affect the intensity of rivalry because we have to fight to gain market share if nobody knows who we are. Sugar, sugar. A competitive advantage. If one company has a strong competitive advantage, that will decrease the intensity of rivalry. And the other four forces. When you present, bullet form is best, but you want to use enough explanation. Make sure you identify each category. Use the list in the book for specifics within each force so you don't miss any. Some categories can have two or more groupings. For example, we might have two or more sets of buyers. We might have wholesalers and retail. Never use the company name in the micro-environmental analysis. It's not about the company, it's about the industry. Okay, things to remember. Remember that the micro-analysis is about the industry as a whole, but it's from the firm's point of view. It's all about how it could impact the organization. Never, never, never use the company name in the microenvironmental analysis. And make sure to include all 5 forces and +1 if you're a not-for-profit. Cite your sources. Important. You got lots of information you're giving us. Make sure that we know where you got it. And that's the end of Chapter 3, Part 2.